The letter arrived with no return address, written in a tight, looping hand that looked like it had crawled from another century. It came on thick, yellowed paper, sealed with red wax, bearing an emblem unfamiliar to Jonathan Harrow, a serpent, curled around an hourglass. He found it waiting for him on the narrow table in the foyer of his cramped London flat, beside a stack of bills and a takeaway menu. His name was written across the front in black ink that had bled slightly into the fibers, Mr. Jonathan Harrow, and beneath it no address, only the word urgent. He opened it that night while rain tapped at the window panes, and the first chill of autumn crept under the doors. The contents were terse, formal, and altogether strange. To Mr. Jonathan Harrow, I regret to inform you of the passing of your great uncle, Alaric Harrow, of Wraithemoor Manor, North Yorkshire. You are named as the sole heir to his estate, including the house, surrounding lands, and all belongings therein. As per his instructions, the estate must not remain unoccupied beyond the month of his death. You are required to take residence at Wraithemoor by the third Sunday henceforth, or the inheritance shall be forfeit. Signed, E. Whitcomb. Solicitor Whitcomb and Drill Jonathan read the letter twice. He had no knowledge of a great uncle named Alaric. His mother had died when he was a teenager, and his father had rarely spoken of family. A man consumed by bitterness and silence, who left little behind but debts and an old photograph album. He turned the letter over in his hands, searching for signs of a joke or forgery, but something about it felt real, weighty, old world. A holdover from a time when families bore crests and fortunes were passed through bloodlines, like ghosts passed through walls. There was even a train ticket enclosed, London to Ravenshollow, departing the following Thursday. It was already paid for, already waiting by the time Thursday arrived. Curiosity had won out over suspicion. He packed lightly, thinking he would stay a week at most, maybe sign some papers, see the house, then return to his regular life, such as it was. London had never felt like home anyway. His job at the bookstore barely paid enough to scrape by, and his social life had long since hollowed into solitude. There was no one to miss him, no roots to untangle. He could vanish for a week or more, and the city would not notice. The train to Ravenshollow was nearly empty. It passed through long, grey stretches of countryside, where mist hung low across the hills like the breath of sleeping giants. Jonathan watched the fields roll past in shades of brown and green, until the world felt less like England and more like some forgotten pocket of the past. At Ravenshollow station, a man was waiting, tall, pale, and dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat that looked like they hadn't changed in 50 years. He held a placard that simply read, "Harrow." Jonathan approached. "That's me." The man nodded once. "Mr. Harrow, I am Edgar. I've tended the house since your great-uncle's passing. The carriage is waiting." He led Jonathan to a long black car, more shadow than machine, and they set off down a narrow road flanked by ancient trees that clawed at the sky. The deeper they drove, the darker the forest grew, until even the sunlight seemed hesitant to follow. Fog curled at the edges of the path, and the wind carried the distant call of crows when the trees finally parted. Wraithemoor Manor rose from the land like a wound that refused to heal. It was vast, crumbling, and covered in ivy that twisted up its stone walls like veins. The windows were tall and narrow, their glass dulled by age. A tower stood at one end, capped by a steep slate roof. The front doors were carved with strange, twisting shapes, serpents, vines, and faces too worn to be named. "Welcome home," Edgar said. Jonathan stepped from the car and onto the gravel drive. The air smelled of damp earth and rot tin, with the faint scent of old smoke. He felt as though he was standing not in front of a house, but a monument to some forgotten calamity. The doors opened with a groan that echoed down unseen halls. Inside, the air was colder than the forest, and heavy with the musk of old wood mildew, and something sour, the scent of something sealed too long behind stone. The foyer was vast, lit only by the dim light bleeding in through stained glass windows. A grand staircase led upward, flanked by portraits of unsmiling men and women who looked vaguely familiar, as if he'd seen them once in a dream. "You will find the master suite prepared," Edgar said, leading him through a hall of dark wood, bough, and faded tapestries. "Meals will be served at 7. I advise you not to wander at night." Jonathan paused. "Why not?" Edgar's eyes did not waver. "The house remembers its own." He said nothing more. That night, Jonathan explored the master's suite, a cavernous room with high ceilings and heavy curtains. The bed was a four-poster, carved with the same serpentine patterns that adorned the front doors. A fireplace stood, cold and empty. There was a wardrobe, a desk, and a tall mirror in the corner covered by a black cloth. When he reached for it, a sudden chill passed through him, and he let the cloth remain. Dinner was served in a dining room lit by a brass chandelier, its candles flickering as if in protest. Edgar brought him lamb stew, bread, and red wine that tasted like it had been bottled during the reign of kings. Jonathan asked about his great-uncle, what kind of man Alaric had been, but Edgar offered only this. He kept to himself, rarely left the house, rarely spoke, but the house. It spoke to him. Later, as the night deepened and the wind howled through the trees, Jonathan lay in bed, unable to sleep. The house creaked and groaned, as if adjusting to his presence, like old bones shifting after too long in silence. Somewhere below, a door slammed, though Edgar had said no one else lived there. At some point in the early hours, he heard footsteps in the hall, slow, dragging, deliberate. They paused outside his room. Then, after a moment, continued on. He got up, opened the door, and peered into the corridor. It was empty, but the candles along the wall had been lit. He was sure he hadn't lived there. And as he turned back into his room, he noticed the mirror in the corner. The one he hadn't uncovered was now bare, and in its reflection, someone stood behind him. But when he turned, the room was empty. He stood there, heart pounding, eyes scanning every corner. Then the whisper came. Welcome home, Jonathan. Jonathan did not sleep that night. He sat upright in the bed, eyes fixed on the mirror across the room, its black cloth now lying on the floor, as if removed by unseen hands. The reflection showed only him, the bed, the room, and nothing else. But the whisper still echoed in his mind, curling through his thoughts like smoke through rafters. Welcome home. The voice was neither male nor female. It was thin, crackling, like brittle paper rubbed between, fingered when the dawn came, weak and grey through the narrow windows. He finally stirred. He got dressed and left the suite, walking the halls to shake the feeling from his skin. The house was even more vast than it had seemed. Corridor after corridor, staircases that twisted upward into tower rooms and downward into locked doors. The wallpaper had faded into pale green and brown patterns like lichen on bark. Paintings hung tilted on their hooks. Some were portraits, the same Harrow faces he'd seen in the foyer. Others were landscapes, all of them grim. One showed Prize, the manor itself, painted in winter, its windows dark, its tower crowned in crows. Edgar was already up. Jonathan found him in the breakfast room, folding linen napkins with a soldier's precision. "I'd like to ask you something," Jonathan said. Edgar nodded without looking up. "Did you come into my room last night?" A pause. "No, sir. I do not enter once the door is shut." "Then who uncovered the mirror?" Another pause. Edgar looked up then, face unreadable. "There are places in Wraithemoor that do not sleep. Sometimes they stir. The mirror, I suggest, should be left alone." Jonathan frowned. "What does that mean? What's behind it?" "Only reflections," Edgar said. "But reflections remember more than we do." He turned and left the room. Jonathan sat at the table, untouched toast before him, and felt the house breathing. He had grown up in silence, but this was different. This was not absence. This was waiting. That afternoon, he began exploring again. Each room seemed like a memory left behind. Dust-covered desks, armoires lined with yellowing lace, children's toys forgotten on shelves. In a sitting room near the east wing, he found a stack of journals tied with twine. They belonged to Alaric. The earliest dated back to 1954, the latest to just a few months ago. Most entries were written in a tight, meticulous script. At first, they were mundane, notes about repairs, weather letters unanswered. But by the mid-70s, they shifted. Mentions of dreams. A girl in white walking through the gardens. A knocking sound behind the walls. A door he had not built. Jonathan skimmed a few entries aloud, trying to hear them spoken. "I hear them at night now, in the library, in the cellar, in the north tower. I went up to the tower yesterday and found the window open, but I have no key. There is no key. Not anymore. She took it when she left. The house is hollowing. It feeds on what was. If I do not leave soon, I shall become another echo among them. It remembers me. It won't let me forget." The further he read, the more erratic the handwriting became. Lines dipped and swerved. Pages were stained. Some with what looked like ink, others with something darker. Some pages had been torn out entirely. In one entry, dated only weeks before Alaric's death, he had scrawled a single line repeatedly: "Do not open the black door. Do not open the black door. Do not open the black door." That night, Jonathan dreamt of a corridor longer than any in the house. At the end of it stood a black door. It was iron, ancient, bound in rusted chains, and from behind it came a sound, like nails dragged across stone. He woke in the darkness to find his bedroom mirror was again uncovered, but this time his reflection was not alone. A figure stood beside him in the glass, tall, thin, and cloaked in a shroud of shadows. It wore a crown of thorns. Its face was obscured, but its hand reached out, pressed to the glass. Jonathan turned quickly, but the room was empty, yet the chill remained. He crossed the room, gripped the cloth, and yanked it back over the mirror dot. The next morning, Edgar served breakfast without a word. Jonathan tried to speak, but the older man's face was carved from marble. Finally, Edgar said, "You found the journals?" "Yes. What's the black door?" Edgar set the tea down slowly. "There is a room in the west wing. It was bricked up long ago. Alaric believed it was a place of sickness, a place where something was kept or buried. The black door was not supposed to exist, but he claimed it returned in his dreams. In time, he claimed it returned to the house itself. Is it still there? I do not go near that wing." Edgar's hands shook faintly as he poured. "But tea, Mr. Harrow. There are places in Wraithemoor that were never meant to be entered. They were never meant to be remembered. Let the past keep what it holds." But Jonathan could not leave it alone. Over the next few days, the dreams grew worse. He heard voices whispering from the vents, saw shadows moving across doorways where no one stood. The candles in the halls lit themselves. The clocks stopped at midnight, every one, and sometimes, when he looked in mirrors, he saw rooms behind him that did not exist. One night, the house shook, just once, a deep, slow tremor, like the breath of something sleeping beneath the floorboards. And the next morning, the west wing was no longer locked. The door to it stood ajar. Jonathan stepped into it before Edgar could stop him. Dust hung in the air like smoke. The hallway was darker than the rest of the house. The wallpaper scorched at the edges as if burned. The windows were bricked from the outside. And at the end of the corridor, hidden behind a long tapestry, he found the door. It was black. It was iron. And it bore the mark of the serpent and the hourglass. The handle was cold. He reached for it. He turned it, and the door creaked open. The door groaned as it opened, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness like the throat of a dead god. The stone steps were damp, and the air that poured from below was foul, a mix of mildew, soot, and something else, something ancient. It coiled into Jonathan's lungs like smoke and made him cough as he stepped down, candle in hand, heart beating in his ears. He tried to tell himself that it was only a cellar, that all the stories, the dreams, the whispers, they were just echoes of a lonely house and an overactive mind. But the moment his foot landed on the third step, the candle flickered wildly, and a low sound met his ears. It was not a growl, not a whisper, but something in between, a wet, rasping exhale. The steps curved downward, and the deeper he went, the more he felt the air thicken around him. It was like walking underwater. The flame shrank, threatened to vanish entirely. At the bottom was a stone corridor carved from bedrock, veins of black minerals spidering across the walls. Strange symbols had been etched into the stone spirals. Eyes and serpents with open mouths. He passed beneath an arch inscribed in Latin, Vigilant Tenebris, Claudite, at the darkness watches, seal it forever. Jonathan reached the end of the corridor. There a final door stood, wooden, rotting, and bound with rusted chains. A heavy padlock dangled from the middle. To his surprise, it was unlocked. It clicked open with a casual ease that unsettled him more than any resistance would have. He pulled the chains away and pushed the door open. The room inside was small, square. Its walls were stone, its floor marked with a sunken circle of ash. Candles, long since melted to stumps, sat at each corner of the room, fused two metal sconces. In the center was a chair, and in the chair was a skeleton. The remains were human, mostly, dressed in rotted robes, its bones curled inwards, as though it had died screaming. Its hands were bound with silver wire, and on its skull a crown of iron thorns sat like a curse that could not be removed. Around the chair, more symbols were carved in blood, it seemed. Symbols that pulsed faintly, as if remembering heat. Jonathan stepped closer. The moment his shoe touched the edge of the circle, the flame in his candle vanished. The room leaped, not darkened. Instead, it lit up faintly. Faintly, with a dull red glow that seemed to seep from the stones themselves. The skeleton shifted, its jaw opened slightly, and from it came a whisper, a soundless breath that echoed only in Jonathan's mind. You are the last. He stumbled backward, heart hammering, eyes wide. The symbols on the floor began to flicker. One by one, the melted candle stumps reignited, and then the skeleton's head tilted slowly in his direction. He turned and ran, up the stairs, through the black door, through the west wing, not stopping until he reached the main corridor, where Edgar stood waiting. You opened it, Edgar said, voice hollow. There's something alive down there. Edgar shook his head slowly. It is not alive. It never was. But it remembers. Jonathan tried to speak, but Edgar raised a hand. There is no time, the old man said. Alaric held it. He was the last. Now you are the blood that remains. What does that mean? Edgar's gaze turned toward the ceiling. And in that moment, every candle in the house went out. The manor groaned, louder than before. The walls pulsed, almost visibly, and the air turned heavy with rot. Come, Edgar said. There is something you must see. He led Jonathan to the library, a vast, two-story chamber, lined with books, bound in leather and dust. In the back, behind a sliding shelf, was a locked cabinet. Edgar opened it with a brass key pulled from a chain around his neck. Inside was a book, thick black, and bound in a material that looked like stitched flesh. He opened it carefully. "This is the Harrow book," he said. "It contains the line of your blood and the binding rite." Jonathan stared at the pages filled with drawings of symbols he had seen in the basement, writings in ink that shimmered red, and illustrations of a crowned figure seated in flame. "It is called the Hollow King," Edgar said. "It was bound here before your ancestors built Wraithemoor. They used the house to cage it. The bloodline was the key. One harrow to hold it. One life to keep the seal intact. And Alaric, he was the last. Yes, and now it's me. Yes." Jonathan stared at the book. "So what happens if I don't accept it?" Edgar's eyes did not blink. "Then it walks." As if in answer, a tremor passed through the house. The chandeliers swung far below. Something howled. Not an animal, not a man, but something that wore both voices like stolen skin. "You cannot kill it," Edgar said, "but you can keep it, bind it, seal it again, if you perform the rite." Jonathan turned a page. There were drawings, a circle, a crown, blood from the hand, and the phrase, "The flesh holds the gate." The name seals the crown, and below it the symbol of the hourglass wrapped in a serpent. Why didn't anyone ever destroy it? Edgar shut the book. "Because we cannot destroy what we've forgotten how to create. The Hollow King is memory, pain, regret. It is made from what we bury." The ground shook again. From somewhere upstairs, glass shattered. They rushed to the hallway. The mirror outside Jonathan's room had cracked. A black liquid seeped from it, thick, slow, like oil. In the reflection, the figure stood again, but it had moved closer. It was reaching out, and behind it, a room of flame stretched on forever. "We're running out of time," Edgar said. "If you are to do this, it must be tonight." The seal weakens fully at the 13th hour of the 13th night. Jonathan realized something. Tonight is the 13th night since I arrived. Edgar nodded. "You were never meant to inherit a fortune, only a burden." They prepared the ritual as the sky collapsed into storm. Thunder rolled above the moors. Lightning cracked across the trees. Wraithemoor Manor seemed to lean into the chaos, its walls groaning, its windows trembling, as though even the house feared what would come if the seal broke. Edgar moved with quiet urgency, gathering candles, salt, the black book, and a knife that gleamed silver in the candlelight but seemed to flicker with shadow when no flame touched it. Jonathan followed without speaking. He had the sense of walking a dream, or a memory not his own, one etched in blood and stone before he was ever born. The ritual would take place in the cellar, in the circle where the Hollow King had been. First bound, they would reawaken the seal, call the old power by name, and offer the harrow blood as tribute. Not death, not sacrifice, but a pact older than any written law. Jonathan didn't know what he believed anymore. He only knew the truth was real enough to shatter mirrors and tear open doors that should never have existed. They descended the black door staircase one last time. The passage felt even colder now, as if it had dropped 10 degrees since the morning. The candles on the walls had relit themselves. The symbols on the stone pulsed, as if the house itself anticipated what was coming. When they reached the chamber, the figure in the chair had shifted again, its head now fully turned toward the door. Its bony hand had uncurled. The crown of thorns glistened with a wet sheen. Though no water touched it, Jonathan took his place in the circle. Edgar began to chant in a language Jonathan couldn't follow, a rasping, wet tongue that made the very stones quiver. He poured the salt in a perfect ring, lit the candles in order, unlocked the book and held it open to the binding page. Jonathan stared at the drawing, the symbol of the serpent, the hourglass. His blood would be drawn and marked in the center of the sigil, his name spoken over it, and the hollow king, whatever it truly was, would be contained for another generation. "I don't understand," Jonathan said, just before Edgar raised the knife. "Why me?" Edgar looked at him, his face weary beyond years. "Because you were the last who didn't know, and the unknowing are the only ones who can still choose." Jonathan opened his hand. Edgar sliced the palm, a shallow cut, but deep enough for blood to drip freely. It hissed as it hit the circle, as though the stone drank it with thirst. The air thickened. The crown on the figure's skull trembled. Then the chamber shook. The skeleton in the chair began to rise, slow, jerking, its bones grinding. The iron crown melted into a shadowy substance that dripped through the air like ink in water. A voice bled into the room, not loud but vast, ancient, terrible, blood that forgets, name that remembers. I was, I am, I will be again. The candles dimmed. The floor cracked beneath Jonathan's feet. The salt circle burned red. Bind me and become the gate. Jonathan stepped forward, heart racing. The book trembled in Edgar's hands. The pages turned on their own. Page 112. Speak the name. Seal the flame. Edgar flipped to the page. The glyphs twisted, writhed. His voice cracked as he began. I call thee by the name once lost. I seal thee by the name now known. The Hollow King raised its arms. The iron crown floated above it, suspended in air, dripping something black that steamed on the ground. Its skull opened its jaw, but instead of a scream, a sound like thousands of people whispering all at once poured out, flooding the chamber. Jonathan stepped into the center of the sigil, placed his bleeding hand on the circle, and shouted, "By blood, by name, by memory, I seal thee." The circle erupted in white fire. The crown snapped downward. The figure collapsed. The chamber shuddered violently. The air rushed outward in a blast of freezing wind. Then silence. The figure fell still in the chair, limp and smoking. The crown hovered in the air for a heartbeat longer, then drifted toward. Jonathan. Edgar shouted, "Don't touch it." But the crown didn't wait for his touch. It descended on its own, slow, precise, and settled onto Jonathan's head. The pain came instantly, not sharp, but overwhelming. A flood of heat, sorrow, memory. Jonathan saw flashes of lives not his own. Harrow's long dead. screams echoing down corridors. The door, the circle, over and over. The ceiling, the waiting, the price. Then it stopped. The fire extinguished. The crown became weightless, and the hollow king's skeleton crumbled to dust. Jonathan stood in the circle, trembling, breath ragged, vision blurred. Edgar caught him as he collapsed. "You've done it," the old man whispered. "You've sealed it again." But even in that moment of relief, Jonathan knew the truth. He had sealed it, but he had also become it. The manor sits in silence once more. Its windows are shuttered, its doors locked. The fog never lifts from the surrounding moors. Visitors do not come to WRAITH, emo, or dot, and those who wander too close at night sometimes hear the voice of a man whispering behind the glass of an upper tower window. A man who does not sleep and does not age. A man who wears a crown of thorns. He is not alone, the house remembers, and so does he.